Alright, hello everyone, welcome to our lesson for this week. We are going to focus on the Korean War today. So our objectives and standards: to analyze how Korea became divided and to explain how the Chinese involvement in the war affected American strategy. Take a look at the standards too. And our vocabulary preview: 38th parallel, amphibious, and demilitarize. And here's our think about this question. So please answer this in the think about this section. What area of the world are we discussing when we talk about the Korean War? Would that be A, South America, B, Asia, or C, Africa? So what part of the world are we talking about, A, B, or C? And our essential question: what was the result of the Korean War? Okay, so some background. So Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and controlled it until the end of the Second World War. Now, when Japan surrendered, Japanese troops in Korea surrendered based on where they were located. So if they were north of the 38th parallel, they surrendered to the Soviets, and if they were south of the 38th parallel, they surrendered to the Americans. So this is going to kind of set up the division for Korea. So in 1948, the Republic of Korea, which is typically called South Korea, established itself in the American zone. Now, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or known as North Korea, formed in the Soviet zone. So again, we have that northern part, which is North Korea, and that southern part, which is South Korea. And North Korea was considered part of the Soviets, and South Korea was considered part of the Americans. So this sets up the division of the country by capitalism and communism. So American forces began to leave South Korea shortly after the end of the Second World War. Now, the Soviets believed that the United States would be unwilling or not fight for South Korea. So as American troops began to withdraw and less remained of American troops in South Korea, the Soviets began to prepare and supply the North Koreans for an invasion of South Korea. So on June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces moved across the 30th parallel, which again was kind of like the division between the two separate areas, and they attacked the South Korean people. Now, the North Korean forces were able to move quickly through the country. South Korea asked the United Nations to step up and stop the invasion. The Soviets were busy boycotting the organization and were not there to vote in favor or against taking some type of action against North Koreans, since they were, they were the ones supplying the North Koreans with these weapons. So either way, since the Soviets were not there to vote, the vote passed by the United Nations to stop the invasion by North Korea. So the United Nations decides to take action to stop this invasion of South Korea by North Korea. President Truman ordered American forces in Japan to support South Korea as well. So 16 other nations also sent troops to help the South Koreans, and they are going to be placed under General Douglas MacArthur. You may recognize his name from World War II. He was in charge of troops in the Pacific during the Second World War, so he is in command of the troops fighting against the North Koreans. Here's a picture of him here. Sometimes you'll see a picture of him with a corncob pipe or a big pipe in his mouth, so you may recognize that picture too. Sometimes that's another picture that they show of him frequently. So there was a counterattack. So North Korean forces had pushed UN troops and South Korean forces to a small area along the southeastern peninsula, and MacArthur is going to launch a counterattack to push the North Korean troops and forces back. So on September 15th, 1950, MacArthur surprised North Korean forces behind enemy lines with an amphibious landing attack at Incheon. And what amphibious landing attack is, it is an attack, I'll show you a picture here. It's an attack that involves all types of, Air Force, ships, ground forces, basically use all types of sea and ground forces to fight a battle. So this is a picture of the landing at Incheon. Okay, so MacArthur was successful with this attack at pushing the North Koreans back. So the UN troops were able to chase the North Korean forces back into their own area, and in November 1950, UN troops approached the border between North Korea and China. Now, it appears the struggle is going to come to an end, and that Korea could possibly be united as a whole country again. But China's gonna make a plan to kind of stop that. So the Chinese government stated that it would not allow American troops near its border with the North Koreans. China wants North Korea as a buffer zone because China is a communist country as well. So China wants North Korea as a buffer zone between, them and anybody else. And they were also threatened by American ships off the Chinese coast. So with this, now the Americans and the communist Chinese will become involved in fighting in the Korean War now as well. So Chinese troops were now able to push the UN forces back, and by early January 1951, all of the UN forces had been pushed back from North Korea. Now Chinese troops pushed into South Korea and captured the capital city of Seoul, and the fighting between these two areas is going to continue for another 2 years. So neither side could really make any advances either way of the North Koreans and South Koreans and their allies. So there was no real kind of advances made by either side. It seems like the struggle was kind of at a stuck point. So General MacArthur comes up with an idea, and he wants to extend the war into China and even propose the use of nuclear weapons against Chinese cities. Now, President Truman is going to reject this plan. He really thinks it's not a good idea. And it's not just Truman who believes that this is not just a good idea, but many others believe that it could upset the Soviets, obviously, and could begin a massive war again or even start World War III. So instead of attacking China, UN and South Korean troops began advancing again, and they were able to push North Korean troops back to where the 30th parallel was. Again, that boundary between North Korea and South Korea. So they're able to push North Koreans back, okay? MacArthur is just simply not happy with the recapture of South Korean territory. He believes that they need to continue to push for a war against the Chinese, and he even went above and against President Truman to try and gain support for his plans. He went to members of Congress, he went to the press, and he tries to build support for this plan without the president's approval. So others warned MacArthur that he had no power to make decisions like that. He's only a general. He really doesn't have any power to, make those types of policy decisions. He needs to listen to President Truman. But again, MacArthur does not listen, and he continued to attack the decisions of President Truman. So remember that the President of the United States is also Commander-in-Chief of the military, so they make the final decisions for the military. So as Commander-in-Chief of the military, Truman decided he could no longer tolerate MacArthur, and MacArthur kind of, making these comments and, and trying to go behind his back to get power from other people. So on April 11th, 1951, Truman decided to fire MacArthur as general of these troops. Now, many Americans were shocked at the decision by President Truman to, fire General MacArthur because remember, General MacArthur had been a very popular general during World War II, and many supported MacArthur and his plans about wanting to fight the Chinese. He had even received a ticker tape parade in New York City for support, and at one point he was even, I think, believed more popular than President Truman for a little bit. With that said, Truman eventually decides to get his own evidence against MacArthur together, and also gets evidence from other supporters who agreed with the dismissal of MacArthur, and public opinion is going to gradually turn against MacArthur, and people are going to realize that it might have been a mistake to fight a war against the Chinese, and eventually MacArthur and his popularity will go away. So on June 23rd, 1951, the Soviet Union proposed a ceasefire. Again, there was no real movement on either side, so there's no real movement going on either side. Nobody's making advances. So the Soviet Union proposed a ceasefire. So people from both sides began truce talks in July 1951, and they agreed to the location of the ceasefire line at the previous established battle line, the 30th parallel. So again, that's where it is today, is where the two countries are divided. And it was also decided to establish a demilitarized zone, where what this is a band of military forces in a certain area for both sides, okay? So both sides are going to spend another year working on prisoner exchanges, but in July 1953, both sides signed the agreement to approve the stalemate. Okay, the North Koreans were pushed back to their borders without the use of an atomic weapon. And however, with that said, to this day, Korea remains two different nations. And if you know what's going, you can, you see this in the news as well, that North Korea and South Korea still are at odds with each other, and there is still a lot of tension there between those two countries. So this is not resolved, but it is, it's the issue is kind of at a standstill right now, and it has been since July 1953. Alright, so this picture here shows you a picture of South Korean forces in the demilitarized zone. As you can, it's not a complete area that's free of military, but you can see they're keeping a watchful eye on the North Koreans. And the other picture shows you a map of what North Korea and South Korea look like, with the 30th parallel being the boundary and the demilitarized zone there. Okay, so our wrap up. So Korea divided at the end of the Second World War. Remember that into North Korean, which remained mostly Soviet, and South Korean, which tend to fall into the capitalism realm. And North Korea, with the backing and support of the Soviets, invaded South Korea. And there was constant struggle between both sides. Finally, the UN and the United States became involved, and there was a struggle between both sides. The struggle was almost over until the UN forces had pushed them back, the North Koreans back to the Chinese border, and the Chinese communists became involved, and it extended the struggle for the country. We also talked about, General MacArthur and his arguments with President Truman about what to do about, these new Chinese fighters. And eventually, there was going to be a stalemate, which resulted in both countries remaining divided to this day. Alright guys, that's all I have. So again, please make sure you answer the questions, and see and talk to you later.